Hello, can you hear me well? Yes, OK, so thank you for being here. Today, I'm presenting open source security, a maintainer's first approach to open source security. Let me go to my next slide. Yes, so I work for GitHub Security Lab. You're probably familiar with GitHub. Some people are not familiar with GitHub Security Lab. I work with, I think, brilliant researchers who basically dedicate their time to finding vulnerabilities in the open source world and trying to share with everybody else how to secure that environment. And we've noticed that people are not very familiar on how they know how to find bugs in regular bugs in an application, but security bugs need to be handled a bit differently. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today, about how both maintainers of open source software and security researchers or vulnerability reporters can work together to secure their software. So open source software is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. We're depending on it, even on solutions that are private. So because of that, we need to spend some time and energy to protect that environment. Some data from all things open source. 90% of IT leaders are using enterprise open source. 95% of enterprises says open source is strategically important. So if it is that strategically important, if it is something that is so essential for us, for sure we need to spend some time and thought and energy on how to protect that environment. Our research, my colleague Awa Otari did some research and talked to some researchers, talked to some maintainers, and basically they realized that if GitHub and even the lab basically helped those two personas, the maintainers and the researchers, to work better together, then we would help the environment to get more secure. So that's basically the point of our research. And it is a security issue, so what? Why is it not just just like any other issue, right? Because maintainers and contributors are known to work together, to add features, to use pull requests, and augment a software. That's fine. But a security issue is a bit different. It's not quite the same. Why? Not because it's necessarily more important, but because if you disclose a vulnerability and how to exploit a software publicly, then you're telling just anybody on how to exploit that software. So before making that publicly available, you need to make sure that you're protecting your user first. And protecting our users means by making sure that a patch is available. So the disclosure process between the time that we find the security vulnerability and that it's disclosed to the public and disclosed to the maintainers has a very tight schedule and a process that we need to follow carefully to make sure that we're not endangering the users of that software or any components that are dependent on our software. So that's what's important in a security issue. And what do we need? How do we know how to contribute security and vulnerability to maintainers? Well, most projects, we realize, don't have a security policy. And what a security policy is, basically is maintainers telling reporters, saying, if you find a security vulnerability in our software, this is how we want that vulnerability to be reported to us. And unfortunately, from each project, open source project, is different from another, so it's never the same thing. It's rarely, at least, the same thing. So the security policy is important for us because it really details on how to do that and who to contact, because you do not want to make that information public. So therefore, the security policy is the best way for you to report that information. And that's an example that I have on the screen right now. It's from systemd. And simply what they do is give a contact information and saying, if you have a vulnerability to disclose, here's who you need to contact and what we want in your report. That's a very simple one. You can go into more details, but that's basically the content of what it should be. So enter CVD. You have a CVD is coordinated vulnerability disclosure. Coordination, from what I've explained before, is the tight schedule that we need to respect and processes to make sure that we don't disclose too early what's going on. So the different step in that vulnerability management process is acknowledgement, then assessment, the patch creation, then the CVE, I'll talk about this a little bit later if you're not familiar with it, and finally, public disclosure. So acknowledgement, basically it's using that security policy, receiving that information, and start by saying thank you, because a reporter actually did you a favor as a maintainer to provide that information to you that that we found a vulnerability in the software. So thank you for contributing that. So that's the first part of the acknowledgement. And then mentioning how long it will take the team to get back to them. Because most security researchers or vulnerability reporters think that what they found is maybe urgent. Some may not, but most of the time they think it's urgent and it's important. And if you don't get back to them swiftly of what they think is swiftly, they might think that you're not taking this seriously. So setting the expectation from the start and just saying, we've received your request and we will get back to you in a certain amount of days. We'll keep them waiting, and you're communicating in advance what to expect. So you're setting that expectation. So that's for the acknowledgement. Next step is assessment. So what is it that a maintainer need to assess when they receive a vulnerability report? Well, there's a concept in security that most security professionals know about. It's called the CIA Triad. So the C is for confidentiality. And when people think about security, most of the time they think about that. You know, is the information confidential? Can an unauthorized user have access to that information? But then we need also to think about integrity. Okay. Can somebody who shouldn't have access is able to change that information and affect the integrity of the data? And then finally, availability. Is the availability of that software or that component is compromised? Can very sensitive information or crucial functionality of that software component be affected to the point where it's not working anymore? So if it affects any one of these components, this confidentiality, integrity, or availability, then we're talking security. If it's not that, the maintainer may get back to you and say, you know what you found, maybe a bug, but it's simply a bug, it's a regular bug. You can open a public issue. It's not a security vulnerability. However, if it is a security vulnerability, then the process continues. But how do we do this assessment? We know what we're looking for. We're looking at the CIA, but we need a good report, right? A good report for us, for the maintainers to make the assessment. And what does the report have? Well, the report needs to explain the vulnerability. We tend to think that everybody's, as security researchers or security professionals, sometimes we think everybody knows what we're talking about, but you wouldn't be surprised that maintainers build components, but they don't necessarily have a basic understanding of security or security vulnerabilities. So you don't know who you're going to talk to, and the assumption as a reporter is that you're talking to someone who understands technology, but not necessarily security specifically. So you need to make sure that you really, really simplify the way you explain that vulnerability and what it is. And the analogy that I love to use for this is basically going to the doctor, right? And you're getting a diagnosis. If you're getting a diagnosis, something's not going well. You know, you're worried. Something's wrong. But what makes the visit a bit more pleasant is when you have a doctor that can explain exactly what's going on. What is it that I have? Okay. Having a clear explanation helps. Something that helps even more is explaining the impact. Okay, so what does that mean for me? What does it mean for my life? Do I need to take a leave of absence from work, from school, or do I keep going? You know, is it a cold or is it cancer? Like, the impact makes a huge difference after understanding. So having an explanation of what it is, and on top of that, what makes the visit even better is having a solution, a clear path to getting back to your healthy self. So, end of the analogy here is the same thing, here's your vulnerability, here is what it is, here how it impacts your software, and possibly, it's not always the case, but a good vulnerability report sometimes will explain how to fix it and provide that information as well. So that's part of an excellent report that can help a maintainer who's technically competent in their software, in their component, but doesn't have to be a security specialist to quickly understand what is going on and how to fix what you've declared. Okay, so an effective report, what I'd like to see. I've mentioned a few things already, but let's go step by step. A detailed description of the vulnerability, exactly what it is, the impact of the vulnerability, how does it affect the software, and why is the impact important? It's important because as open source maintainers have a list of things, of requests, of features to do. Depending on which team you're talking to, sometimes they do have a huge team working with them, but it's not the norm. The norm, it's a small team, and sometimes it's even just one maintainer. So they do have a list of things going on, and it may not be their priority. So having the impact well explained can help them assess if it's something urgent that they need to assess right now or fix right now, or if it's something that they can wait and take their time to do. So that's what the impact does for them. A list of affected versions, meaning, okay, which version of my software does this affect, and which one do I need to fix, and how to communicate it. And precisely the code introducing which line in the code, not just, oh, there's a problem in your software somewhere. No, specifically the line of code. If you can identify the line of code that introduces the issue, then you're precisely saying that's where it needs to be fixed as well. Another thing that's really helpful for a maintainer and maintainer teams is a proof of concept, a POC. So that POC helps them be able to reproduce the vulnerability that you found and to say, yes, this is really happening. It's not something just in theory, and I see the effect of what the vulnerability does to my software. And finally, you can, like I mentioned before, a remediation advice and a proposed fix to help them move forward. And then the process continues, which is patch creation. Patch creation, as I said, maintainers don't always have the knowledge to fix it, but they are. We are promoting a maintainer-first approach, meaning that they are in charge of their project. They get to decide how to move forward, how to fix the vulnerability. But as a vulnerability reporter, I think it's important, if you have the cycles for it, to mention to maintainers, I am available to help you. If you have questions about my vulnerability report, please don't hesitate to contact me. And to maintainers, I'll say the opposite. I'll say, if you didn't get that message from the vulnerability reporter, don't hesitate to go back to them and reach out and say, you know what, we'll be working, thank you again for your report. We've noticed that it's something important that we need to fix. Would you be available to help us, even if we found the fix, to help us maybe verify that the fix is complete and thorough enough for it to not find other vulnerabilities? So work together on that. And patch creation has a challenge, because that patch creation cannot be done in the public repo, right? And that's where I want to talk to you about the GitHub Security Advisories. GitHub Security Advisories are basically a private fork that the maintainers can invite. Currently, that's how it works. I think changes are coming up. But currently, that's how it works. Maintainers invite reporters into that private fork, and that's where they can discuss privately that vulnerability and work on a fix together. And so again, that fixes the issue of not publicly talking about that vulnerability, publicly saying to everybody there's something wrong with our software. And since it's led by the maintainers, because we've had issues where somebody said, oh, there's a fix for that, for that software, but if the maintainer is not aware of that, we want the maintainers to lead that process, right? To be in charge of that process for their own software. So they invite the reporters into the private fork, and they work together in that private environment. They can discuss, and they can collaborate and work on a fix. The GitHub Security Advisories, I'll talk about it a bit later, but helps for the next step, the Common Vulnerability and Exposure Number, the CVE. CVEs are a bit like Pokemons for security researchers. Basically, they really, really love them. It's it's on their CVs, it's on their resumes of saying, I found a vulnerability that didn't exist before. So they really like that. So as a maintainer, for someone, a vulnerability reporters that helped you find a vulnerability in your software, you want to help them get their CVEs, saying, yes, this vulnerability really helped us protect our software and provide the CVE. And because GitHub, the platform, is the company is a CNA where we can provide the CVE. We're not the only one. MITRE, as you might know, is also a CNA. We can provide a CVE. With the GitHub advisory, we're able to provide a CVE to the security reporters if they helped fix and find is the requirement, but helped also fix the vulnerability. So the CVE is an important part to give credit to whoever helped find a vulnerability and fix that vulnerability as well. And finally, public disclosure. So public disclosure, you may think that once we have a patch, everything is done. But what is the purpose of a patch if nobody is aware of it? So the notification part of the process is actually really important once you have a patch, making sure that all your users are aware of the vulnerability. You tell them clearly how bad it is and what are the steps they should be taking to fix their own version to identify if they have a vulnerable version, and then how to fix it, and give them a path to update. So really keep that easy for them to move forward. But that, again, notification is an important part. It's not at the end of the patch creation. You really need to make as much noise as you can on all the platforms that you have to be able to notify your users, but it's definitely something that needs to be done once a patch is already there. Possible hurdles, because things don't always go as planned, right? And there's hurdles for maintainers, and there's hurdles for vulnerability reporters. So for a researcher that discloses a vulnerability, sometimes you can't always establish contact with the project team. I talked about a security policy, but despite, I want everybody to have one, but the truth is not everybody has thought about the process of finding a security and realize that finding a security bug is different. So sometimes you can't establish contact. So the best way to do that sometimes is to open a public issue and to say, I have a security vulnerability. I will not provide the details of it, but here's how to contact me and how to move forward. And how do you want to move forward as a process if you don't have an email to contact and to give them that information? Sometimes there's a disagreement between the maintainers and the researchers on the deadline, right? The researcher wants to disclose as soon as possible because they get their CV, they get their Pokemon, but then the project says, oh, it's not a priority for us, and there's a disagreement for that. Our recommendation at GitHub Security Lab is basically to respect the maintainer's time, give them a deadline. The industry standards is 90 days, but if you see that within those 90 days they're making progress, but they're not quite there yet, please understand the restrictions that they have and give them the time that they need to move forward. If you have to go public with that information, of course, go public. You're allowed. You have your disclosure policy to go public after those 90 days, but always think about the consequences of what you do, because the project team usually does the best they can. Something that can happen is that the project team is also unresponsive. And again, I'll mention that open source is not always well-funded, not the best resources, not the number one priority. So don't take it as a personal attack as a researcher, as a reporter, that they're not responding. It's not that they're not taking your issue seriously. It's basically that there's 24 hours in a day, there are priorities in life, and sometimes your issue is simply not something that they can handle right now. When things don't go as planned on the maintainer's side, you can't patch in time. The vulnerability was reported publicly. Basically, that's the opposite of what I said in the beginning, is to be as public about it as possible, to say, this is what we're working with. Please identify if the component that you're using is vulnerable, and do the best you can, and report as much as possibly what's going on. So again, recap quickly. I'm running out of time, but maintainers have a security policy telling people how to report their vulnerability, notify your consumers, tell them once you have a patch available, and give credit to reporters by using CVEs. And finally, reporters have a disclosure policy to say how you work to the maintainers, go look at their security policy to make sure that they move forward, and have empathy. Think about who you're talking to and understand that even if it's important and they understand that it's important, it might not be their priority. You're a contributor, and be a great OSS doctor. That's all I have for you. Thank you very much for your attention. I'd like, again, if you're not familiar with the GitHub Security Lab, I'd invite you to go check it out and understand that we're here to help the open source environment to be more secure. And we do have office hours where maintainers can come and see us and say, we have issue, we don't know how to handle that, and we are gladly happy to help maintainers make their project more secure. Thank you for your attention.